as we are. This is a workshop for the Planning, Zoning, and Historic Commission. And so the public is definitely welcome to participate, to watch, but we're leaving this to these three commissions right now to ask questions after the presentation is made. There will be plenty of time for everyone to speak and ask questions about this in the future. We will have 2 public Zoom meetings where presentations will occur again for the public to attend. We will also have an open house. After that is done, there will be a follow-up Planning Commission public hearing where the public can again speak, and there will be a presentation there. And the Planning Commission will hopefully recommend, not recommend, or recommend with changes the adoption of this to the City Council. It will then go before the City Council, where there will be several meetings and public hearings. There will be this is a type 1 action, so the City Council will have to declare its intent to act as lead agency. It will have to vote on that seeker as well, and then eventually adopt the zoning ordinance, which at this point we are anticipating would happen hopefully at the beginning of June. So just to lay it out for you, this is just the initial unveiling. Nothing is set in stone, and the public hasn't seen the zoning ordinance. We will probably post it after comments from everyone tonight. We might make some minor tweaks, and then before we have the first public meeting, which will be in February, then we will post it online. Again, if you go to the planning department's website or Recode Troy website that you may have seen from the initial email, you can keep updated there on when the meetings are going to be. So again, we're not trying to keep anybody out of it. We just wanted to direct this towards the commission members at first. So I'm going to hand it off to Monica Ryan, and I'm just going to say that this is the second time I've been involved with the rezoning, and also the second time I've been involved with River Street Planning. I think we're in good hands with River Street Planning. They had offices at Monument Square for years and years, and know Troy very well and have done lots of research. And even more recently, driving around trying to make sure that everything in the new zoning ordinance is in keeping in character with the city of Troy. And I know people are going to be sick of me saying this. This is a total rewrite of the zoning ordinance. Everything has changed and nothing has changed. So this new zoning ordinance preserves the character of the city of Troy as everyone wants to see it. The current zoning ordinance is suburban in character from 1985. It's vague, it's contradictory, and it does not supply very good guidance to the Planning Commission and city staff as well. So I believe we've done a great job taking care of that. And now I'm going to hand it off to Monica to do a presentation. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Let me first try. I just need just 1 second. Okay, hopefully everybody can see this screen. Steve, are we good? Everyone can see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to just go to the next slide. So just by way of introduction, I am Monica Ryan from River Street Planning, as Steve mentioned. And with me also tonight is Margaret Irwin of River Street Planning. She is the owner of River Street Planning, principal. Christine Snyder is also part of our team from River Street, and Amy Ferguson. Also on tonight's meeting is Lawrence Howard. He is our land use and planning attorney for this project, and he has a lot of experience in zoning updates, and he is also local to our communities, hailing from Averill Park. Mark Newman and Place Alliance were our urban designers on this project, and they provided a lot of the graphic guidance and design considerations as we looked at the city in terms of existing character and looking forward. And James Voigt of Streamworks is our engineer who specializes in flood risk and river water movement, and he has been instrumental in some aspects of this project as well. Our partners are the Department of State Coastal Resources program. This was funded partially through a Waterfront Revitalization Program grant, as well as the Troy Redevelopment Foundation are also funding partners. Our city staff, who worked very hard with us all through this process, have been Steve Streichman, James Rath, who has moved on, but he was the city planner through a good portion of this project, and Aaron Vera, who is the city engineer and was also the Planning Commission chair through part of the project before he moved over. And then we had a steering committee of community members and those involved in the city of Troy, including Josh Chapone, Christian Grigoroskos, Patrick Harris, Katie McLaren from the ZBA, Jeff Merrill, who is a developer who's worked on a lot of projects in the city of Troy, Andrew Ross, who is Ross Valve, so a business owner, Claude Rounds representing RPI, Sandra Rouse representing South Troy as a neighborhood, as a neighbor resident, Michael Williams from the CDTA, and Aaron Vera, of course, was also on the committee and was the planning head of the Planning Commission at the time. We have worked together for 2 years on this project. Our accomplishments, we started with the diagnostics of the existing zoning and other development regulations in the city. So not everything is about zoning, but our task was to take on the zoning ordinance. So we did an audit of the existing code and also looked at that in relation to modern techniques to see where there are gaps or where there are major updates needed. We reviewed the comprehensive plan, which is the backbone plan for all zoning considerations. By state statute, the comprehensive plan is the driver of the zoning, and implementation of the comprehensive plan is your zoning ordinance. So it's a really important component, as are other planning initiatives, of which the city has many. As we were doing the update, planning initiatives were taking place at the same time. So the city's always looking at new things, and so we're constantly keeping an eye on those as we were doing this. We also did a fair amount of field analysis, looking at the existing development patterns in the city, the neighborhoods at a block level, looking at land uses, density, changes in setback and character, changes in architectural character, really taking in all of the neighborhoods and trying to get a real handle on what we have today, what works really well, what's really attractive, what makes a great urban environment, and then where we have some significant gaps in how to rework the code to make sure that going forward, we fill in those gaps with the patterns of development that we already have in the city and we want to carry forward. So a fair amount of time was spent on field analysis. Another piece of this is looking at variance applications that have been before the ZBA for the past 5 years, because that can be really telling to see what's not working. If you're seeing the same variances over and over again, and you're approving those same variances over and over again, then that means that part of the code is broken. And we did see many patterns that helped us, not that we necessarily needed it because some things were kind of obvious, but the variance application review really solidified what we thought we were seeing and was helpful to see a path forward for some things. We also did research on just current urban zoning updates in the Northeast and New York State. It's important to look at New York State because our regulatory framework is different than other states. And it's important to look at the Northeast as a whole because we are an older urban city that we're looking at here. We are not looking to California for how to do infill. So, keeping an eye on the Northeast was our main focus. And there have been several good updates in other communities that were helpful. And then in terms of our work, the steering committee met, I think we had 15 meetings. We started out in person and then we had to shift to Zoom. And we had some really good meetings online. I think that actually worked fairly well. But we did have at least 15 meetings, and then city staff and ourselves, I think we met at least 35 times, either online, on conference calls, or in person over the past 2 years. So it's been a long but very productive process. So our charge, and I think Steve actually pretty much hit on all of these when he did his summary, but basically this is a new code. It is not an update. Our charge is to modernize the code to include best practices in zoning where they're practical and apply to Troy. Not all best practices are practical or appropriate for Troy, and we really tried to make sure that we didn't zone for zoning's sake. Another key focus was synthesizing and presenting information in a more user-friendly format. The current code is quite dated and is reflective of old zoning ordinances, but there's been a great shift in how to present information in a much more user-friendly way, a lot less legalese, more graphics, etc. And then updating the permitting and review process was actually quite important for this code update. There were some things that were out of compliance or not reflective of state statutes, some cumbersome language that didn't really provide a good process for the boards. So we really did try to synthesize and streamline permitting processes and review processes for the boards, while also providing more guidance as they work through each application. Our fifth charge was to protect and enhance the community character. Troy has a lot of historic character, a lot of very intact and wonderful neighborhoods where, you know, our charge is not to change that, it's to just enhance things. So we've done the best we can to try to really update the code in that respect, because right now there are no, for the most part, there's very little guidance on building form and architecture in the present city code. So really tried to focus on that, as well as sustainable development practices and resilience, which are, of course, on a lot of people's minds these days with in all code updates and other planning initiatives. And lastly, to de-suburbanize the code. The current code, as you all work with it, may realize that it's a fairly suburban code. The setback requirements, just the all-around feel, the parking requirements, it was done in the 80s, and many codes in the 80s have that feel. And our charge was to de-suburbanize this code and really, you know, recreate a more urban infill environment for development. So that's my introductory spiel. The rest of this is more of a technical summary of the highlights, although it is long, so there's many highlights, or I guess, but to sort of run through a summary of what is in the draft. So I'm going to start with the zoning, something that most of you should be familiar with, which is what we would typically call zoning use districts and map. We do carry over that function in the new code. This map, we have two maps actually in this code. The first is a use map, and it functions like a traditional zoning map in that there are use districts. This map, your current code has 21 districts and overlays. We have reduced that to 13 districts and 1 overlay. In the way we were able to do that is to allow for more, we created more mixed use districts and reduce the number of redundant districts that really, some of them had only 1 or 2 changes in uses and not a whole lot else going on the use side of the districts. So we were able to consolidate those down. And by creating more mixed use districts, we are also able to eliminate a couple of others. So I would say that for the most part, the uses are relatively reflective of the current environment. We didn't eliminate a lot of uses. I think we've added uses that just simply weren't mentioned in districts before, but I think you'll find that a lot of these districts are fairly reflective of the current environment. The map also functions with a use table. This is an upgrade from your current code where everything is in narrative lists. Each district has a list of, in your current code has a list of uses that are allowed. And then as you go up in intensity, it basically then refers you back to the previous district. That's a very difficult way to try to find something in a zoning code. So one of the important updates was to shift to this table way of presenting uses and where they're located in districts. So we've got a table with the districts across the top. The uses are grouped together by general categories of residential, community services, commercial, and they are all listed along the side here. And then within each district, you will see either a P for permitted, and that's permitted as of right, although they may require site plan review. An SU is a special use permit, so that will require a special use permit, probably as well as site plan review. If it is blank, it's not permitted. And then on this far right side, we have additional regulations cross-referenced. This is for those uses where there may be additional regulations. So the use may be allowed, however, this just alerts the user that there are also other regulations that may pertain to whatever that activity is that you're doing. Not every use has additional regulations, but we do have that cross-referenced right on the table. So we think
I'll just add in there's 5 pages of this table roughly,
yes.
And that replaces like the 20 pages you used to have to scroll through to figure out if something was permitted or not.
Right. So this is an important update just from a user-friendly standpoint, if nothing else. We also do have here, I've cross-referenced the definitions. The definition section has been completely updated as well. Every use that's on this list is listed in the definition section of the code, which has been moved to the back, but it is there. So it's a much more comprehensive list of definitions, and definitions are extremely important in zoning. Sometimes they can be really the most important thing. Well, you know, was that defined? How is that defined? So it's important. It's at the back of the document instead of the front now, but every use on this table is listed in that section. So the other component that used to be with the use districts, when the zoning districts would have 2 components, that would be the uses and how the lot can be developed, the setbacks, the bulk standards. So we've separated those into two maps and 2 sets of standards. So the second piece of this then is the lot development and building form. So lot development and building form considerations in zoning have changed a lot in the last 20 years. You'll be aware of the term form-based codes, and that is looking more at building form and function within the streetscape and how neighborhoods are sort of integrated together. So what we've tried to do is take the best elements of form and include them in this code update without overcomplicating things. When you look at the block level of this code, you'll see that we have really dialed into that level of how sites should be developed. And I think that will help to recreate some of the urban fabric that may be falling apart in some neighborhoods, and really re-solidify it in those places where it's relatively stable. What we did find when we looked at the block level of the city is that you do see repeated patterns of, so stay on this page, repeated patterns of the same types of form and character. And we were able to really look at that and say, maybe we can create something that we can repeat and is not overcomplicated. So that's what we strive for. The other piece of this is to, again, make it more user-friendly. The current code lists out in narrative form for each district how a lot can be developed in this lot characteristics section. So that in itself, we've transformed the way the whole thing is presented. So you will no longer see the narrative form of this in the code. And again, as mentioned earlier, our charge was to de-suburbanize. So you will find that these lot characteristics we're going to talk about are they're fairly different than what's in the current code. So again, here, these aerials are just to show just the sheer difference between some of the, the scale and density of the city and how much things can change at the block level. So some of these, so in looking at this, we were able to try to find repeated patterns and create a regulatory framework for this to work. And so what we've got here, this is a very finicky, is another map. So we've created 8 districts of recurring patterns of character that we found throughout the city. There are a couple of unique scenarios, and that would be like our civic campus type, the college campuses, school campus, hospital campus areas, and then a couple of other just more unique development scenarios, including, for instance, like the Hoosick Street corridor, perhaps the South Troy waterfront. So we did create one district that's a little more flexible, and then we repeated these patterns on a map, and at the block level, they change. And the way this works with the use map is you're looking at the uses to see what uses are allowed, and then you look at this map to see what district you're in to figure out what your lot development standards would be. And then we've created these sheets that go with that map that show the lot characteristics for each district. And so what
Monica, sorry to interrupt. Can you
Yep.
go back to that previous map? I just want to show an example.
Okay.
Okay, so if you look at RPI, which is that light blue in the center around the red, and you can see that is a institutional zone. But if you look at the edges along Tibbetts Avenue, you can see that the density or the lot development is different there. So yes, you can do anything in the RPI institutional zone that's, the type of thing you could do at a campus, but when you get out to Tibbetts Avenue, you can't build an 8-story building. So that's how you have the districts that say what you can do, and then the development standards that may be different.
Right, that's actually a really good example, because we basically took the interior of the campus and said, okay, you have the flexibility of some campus standards within the campus, but once you get to the streetscape where you're bordering a neighborhood, now the character of what you want to do on the edges of the campus has to meet what the neighborhood characteristic is. So we literally changed the zone that the campus was in at the street, at the edges of the campus. That's a really good example. And we do have some examples to run through here, so I will do that. So what I wanted to just do, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. So some of the elements on the pages we're going to show you in a second. So we eliminated minimum lot sizes and minimum square footages for dwelling units. So there is not a cap on density per se. Eliminating the minimum lot size will definitely improve the ability to use infill lots around the city. We did keep the lot widths in the really low density neighborhoods, but other than that, the elimination of the minimum lot size requirement, I think, will add some significant flexibility. We also created build two lines and maximum setbacks for front yards. Certainly the suburban form of setbacks of 50 feet and 25 feet creates a very suburban environment where most buildings in an urban environment are built to the street. So we've created build two lines or maximum front setbacks. We do have some minimums in areas that are more, I guess you would almost, the least dense neighborhoods, the more modern residential developments that have taken place in the city. Some of them do have setbacks, and we did maintain that. So we do have a district that focuses on a more, I guess you would say, almost suburban feel. But then the other districts increase in density and the setbacks reduce as you move through the city. We do also have height minimums, not just maximums, so that you cannot build, in a neighborhood that is mostly 2 and 2-story buildings, 3-story buildings, 5-story buildings. You could not build that 1-story structure that doesn't really work with the neighborhood. So there are some building height minimums in some districts in some parts of the city. We still have some setbacks, as I mentioned. We do have side setbacks and rear setbacks where they're appropriate. Some areas are fairly well built out or have shared wall, shared lot lines. So, we've maintained that character where it exists, and we have districts for that. We changed from a maximum impervious building or maximum building coverage to impervious surface coverage. That's a change. The current code, I think, has a maximum building coverage. So we shifted to impervious surface because that's more important in terms of maintaining green space permeability. Obviously, a paved parking lot has just as much imperviousness as a rooftop. So we did make that change. And we do have standards for where to locate parking and accessory structures and uses, just like your current code. And lastly, we did address encroachments, which are elements that might encroach into setbacks and the right-of-way, porches, canopies, things of that nature. So we address all of those things on these sheets. And so each district has one of these. There are 8 of these pages, and they all address the things I summarized. They provide illustrations of how how they work, and a couple of photographs, as well as an intent summary in the corner. So hopefully this will provide a lot more visual guidance for the boards when they're looking at development. We tried to cover as many things as we could without being overly prescriptive. So, we're hopeful that this will provide a lot more guidance than the current code provides. What we have, and here's a couple of others. So this is the quote, I guess you would say, more suburban residential neighborhood format. And then you'll see the most intense is the downtown core. So you can see just by looking at the graphics that everything kind of jumps in scale and density and site build out. So just for a couple of examples. I'm going to run through a couple of example scenarios of how this would work, because I think it's really easier to do that than just describing this. So we've taken the former Price Chopper Plaza in Lansingburg as a redevelopment site. So we're assuming here that the property is acquired, or if somebody's thinking of buying it. So it's a 3+ acre site with 435 feet of road frontage, 340 feet of depth. And the adjacent property is in play as well. So somebody owns this site and is thinking of buying the site, and they're looking at what you could do with it. So the first thing you would do was go to the use map, and you'd locate the property up here in Lansingburg, and you'd see that it's in the Waterfront mixed use district. So then you would go to the permitted uses Schedule A, find the Waterfront mixed use district, and then you can go down the 5 pages looking at all the uses that are allowed in that district. And so at that point, if you know what you want to do, or you want to find out more about the build out of the site and what would be permitted, then you would go to the other map and you would locate the same site up here, and it's in the neighborhood 4 district. And these are called intensity zones. So you would go to the neighborhood 4 intensity zone in the code, which is this neighborhood 4 chart. And then you could see all the build out characteristics that are allowed for that property. So that's how you would look at it from the I've identified the site, what can I do with it perspective. The flip of that would be, I am a multifamily housing developer and I would like to build a development. In this case, I've used this existing, somewhat iconic Troy building and to say, where could you build this? So if a developer wanted to essentially, maximize what they could do on the site with almost 100% build out of the lot, a 4-story structure, thinking about the number of units they're looking to build. So what you would start there is step one, where am I allowed to do multifamily? So you'd go to the use chart and although I have highlighted here accidentally single family, I should say multifamily right under here, go to the multifamily and you can see all the districts where multifamily is allowed, where the Ps are included. And it's all these districts. So now it's allowed in the multifamily, the mixed use 1, mixed use 2, downtown, waterfront, and the campus institutional districts. So then you can look around on the use map at where these districts are located and start thinking about properties in those, in those locations. The next step would be to understand, sorry, my mouse is very fickle, is okay, so where can I build a 4-story building? Because I know I want to do X number of units and I'm going to need a more intense district where I'm allowed to build out to something like 4 stories. Then you look at each of these, you can look at all the intensity sheets and see where am I allowed to really build out properties. And the 4 that leap out are the neighborhood 4, downtown core, downtown edge, and civic campus. And that's because they do allow 4-story structures. There's flexibility in terms of build out of properties, so you would be able to maximize those units. And you can build right to the street wall, so you're able to really use that flexibility. So once you know that, you would put together the use location where multifamily is allowed with these 4 districts, and you could start to drill down to portions of the areas of the city where multifamily, where a larger multifamily housing project could be located, and start looking for infill sites. It's just look at it both ways. This is how you would use these. All right, I'm just going to go through this whole thing and then we can discuss afterwards. I think it's just easier since we can't do the interface of seeing people. So another component of the build of obviously site development is the building form architecture. The current zoning has no architectural guidelines, no standards for I think there's a little bit of, there are some guidelines, I think, in the Hoosick Street district and the T1 in downtown. But for the most part, there really aren't any architectural standards in the code. So we have developed a set of standards that would apply to, to development citywide. They're fairly general, although they're comprehensive in length here, but they stick to general characteristics. We don't dive into this the way some form-based codes do, where they really delve into real specificity about what kind of buildings can be built in certain locations. This is more of a guiding document. There are some elements that say shall, where we really felt strongly they were important, but a lot of it is preferred or should to provide guidance. It's guidance for the planning commission, it's guidance for the development community, it's guidance for city staff when they're looking at projects. So we did try to cover most topics related to building scale, windows, fenestration, things like that, making sure that, buildings are inviting, the windows and doorways are to scale the building size, that buildings are within the scale of each other so that you don't have a 5-story structure next to a 2-story structure. Looking at roof lines, because roofs can be a really important architectural feature. orientation of windows and doors to the streetscape, adding elements like porches and those types of elements on buildings. So there's a wide variety of elements here, but it's really meant to be mostly a guiding document to give the boards something to work off of when they are approached with a project, to try to just get just better architecture, and certainly without them being standards and requirements, there's obviously going to be a lot of room for negotiation with the developer, but at least this gives everybody a jumping off point of what you'd like to see. So there are several pages of these graphics. The narrative supports, the graphics support the narrative, so they're not separate. So you'll see what is said in narrative is then graphically illustrated with pointers to what's being illustrated. And here's another example of one of those pages. So hopefully this will help guide the process. So some of the other things that go along with all of these things we've talked about are these additional regulations, which I discussed are over here in the last column as a cross-reference on the permitted uses table. These are those standards that are common in your code now. We've just added to them or made them more comprehensive in a couple of cases, where you have additional standards for specific uses. Some of the things that you have now include some standards for convenience stores, drive-throughs. I'm blanking off the top of my head. I think related to motor vehicle service stations. I think you have some standards now, and a bunch of other things. So it's that part of the code that you are familiar with now. We've added to that. We've added some standards regarding, and keep in mind that these standards, it doesn't mean that it can mean one of two things. It can mean that the use is unique and therefore inherently has some impacts that might need to be addressed. And sometimes it's that the use is so widely permitted that there are scenarios where you want some additional regulation because they are widely permitted throughout the community. So it can be for both reasons. A good example of that would be accessory dwellings, which we have allowed in this update. We do allow accessory dwelling units with single family homes, but we do have some standards to go with those. Adult uses is a standard in most codes now. You actually don't have those standards in your zoning right now, but we have included them in this ordinance, but that's a very common additional regulation of adult uses. Agricultural uses, is new for this code. We've really expanded support for ag and urban farming, personal agriculture, but with that, we did create a fair amount of standards to go with that, recognizing compatibility with neighbors, et cetera, it's close proximity. So we do have a bunch of standards, but we are widely supportive of agriculture in this update. Cannabis is new to New York State and therefore new to Troy. So we do have some where we can, which is limited, but where we can add some standards in zoning, we did. Car washes is something you have now. These are just some examples, but just to give you a sense of things. Convenience stores, we did update some of those standards. We added a standard for requirements for fresh food. We've enhanced that. There's some standards for small box variety stores. Those are like dollar stores. Motor vehicle repair garages were there before. Home occupations, gas stations, drive-through windows. Solar, we've added standards for us. That's a new use. And there's, very supportive, but there are some things that go with that. And then wireless communication towers and small cell. That's the 5G, the new small facilities that are popping up at breathtaking speed. So there are some new standards for those as well. These are just some examples, but there's a whole article within the code that covers all of these additional regulations. And then we've, as I said, cross-referenced them on the table. So that will be helpful to find them more quickly. And these will apply no matter what. They're not optional. And so supplemental regulations, these are things you have in your ordinance now, but we have added to them. And so these are where you'd find, actually your current code separates these things out, but it's parking and signage, landscaping standards, fences and walls. Those are the more commonplace ones that you see in most codes. So we've added to that list considerably. And most of these are lumped together because they're all sort of site development supplemental regulations that you could see for any particular project. So this is the list of all of them. The new ones, pedestrian linkages is new. Outdoor lighting is in the code now. It's just sort of sprinkled throughout. So so now it's consolidated into one section, and it is more comprehensively updated to provide some decent guidance on light pollution and things like that. Placemaking elements is new. Garbage storage, it was sprinkled throughout. We have consolidated that to be one spot where we talk about storing of garbage receptacles and things on sites. Landscaping and screening is another one that was sprinkled throughout the code. This is a much more expanded section to really provide guidance to the boards and to the staff on landscaping, screening, native plantings, using pollinators. We really tried to planting more trees, really tried to add significantly to the greenscape of the city. We have added watercourse and wetland protection standards for not only the Hudson River, but your other streams, the Post and Kill, Wine and Skill, et cetera. We've got steep slopes development requirements. Stormwater management has its own chapter in the city code, but we added an element, some elements within zoning that we think are important to better manage stormwater management for new development. That could go in the chapter on stormwater management, but that wasn't really in our scope. But we felt these were important, so we've included them here. There's also low impact development and green infrastructure requirements related to stormwater management, also within the code. So these supplemental regulations are greatly enhanced. We're going to talk about a couple of them because they're in your code now, but we've changed them significantly. So I'm just touching on those because we could spend an entire meeting on just this one stretch of things that we're talking about. So I'm going to just highlight a few things. One of our, I would say, one of the charges we were given when we started this project was to address parking standards. Parking standards lead to a lot of variances. The parking standards are very suburban in the city's code. Parking standards in general in modern zoning has changed a lot. Most urban code updates are shifting away from parking, not shifting away from all parking minimums, but really scaling back parking minimums. Exempting downtowns from parking minimums is pretty commonplace at this point, including in your own code now, actually. And then capping the amount of surface parking you can have is becoming very common in codes. So that's been the trend, and a very, I would say in the past 3 to 4 years, there's now been a movement to shift away from parking minimums as a whole and looking at things in a different way, because so many of the parking minimums are arbitrary. But you feel like you have to place a number on every use. Otherwise, how do you know what that parking minimum is? And it just sort of created this really arbitrary list of parking standards. So we looked at this and said, okay, and there are a couple of other examples of communities that are working towards this. What if we really just turned parking on its ear and basically said that we're going to ask the development community to tell us what their parking needs are, and then we'll decide what those should be and calibrate it to reality, calibrate it to the location of the project, what the project use is, who's going to need the parking, what are our parking limitations in that location now, and really look at it from a different perspective. So that's kind of how we decided to look at this. And so we've got a pretty different approach here that we're hoping people are excited about. We've proposed to have no minimum parking standard for surface parking off the bat. So no project will require parking. There's not going to be a two-car minimum, two-space minimum for a single-family home and those standards. We assume parking will be desired because from a marketing standpoint, and the market will drive the need for parking. But we're not going to require any project to have parking at the outset. For small projects, and we do have threshold triggers for these things, you will be required to address what your plans are for parking in a simple parking plan to the Planning Commission and city staff when you present your project. All these projects will require site plan review. That's when this would come up. The only projects that would be exempt from a simple parking plan would be single family homes and other dwellings with no more than 6 bedrooms. We based it on bedrooms because we do have a lot of college housing. And so basing it on number of units, dwelling units, doesn't really equate to the parking situation in the city of Troy. So we did base it on bedrooms. So small projects will be required to provide a simple parking plan. And larger projects, and there's a threshold in this table that I've got here on the screen, is where you see the thresholds for the larger projects, will be required to have a transportation demand management plan, which is a more comprehensive look at what the parking needs are based on demand, other modes of transportation nearby, and whether or not there's already parking on site, who are your users, et cetera. Larger projects, the developers are looking at this internally for their own use anyway. What we are basically saying is you're going to provide that to us. What was your method to determining how many parking spaces you felt you need? You now need to provide that to the city as part of your project and work with the city to determine what the appropriate amount of parking will be needed. So that's the new perspective. It does put a lot on city staff and the Planning Commission to really look at projects, but it's a more comprehensive way of looking at things. The other piece of this is that we have parking maximums. So, and that is a common practice in urban code updates. The way we've looked at this is to allow projects to have a certain number of spaces. It is a fairly limited number of spaces initially. So you are allowed some parking, but we've capped that, and you can see the cap here, and it's based on our neighborhood, our intensity zones, where you find the development standards. You would go to that map, and so the neighborhood 1 through 5 and those districts each have a correlating number of spaces that you're allowed to have. And the threshold of the project dictates how many you can have. Once you've met that cap, if you want more parking, then you would provide a reason for that in your transportation demand management plan if it's a larger project, or in the simple plan if it's a smaller project, to explain why you think you need more parking. All of this applies to surface parking. If you are willing to build a structured parking garage, that's allowed. This is to address surface parking. The idea here is to not overbuild for parking and just create asphalt where it's not necessary. So we're looking at projects at a comprehensive level to determine how much parking you should be required to have. And then before you can overpark, which you saw in that Price Chopper parking lot picture. We're saying you can have this many spaces. After that, you need to justify why you need more parking. So that is our approach. If you want to have more parking, then you can still seek some variances. Just that process still exists. You can seek a variance if you want a certain number of spaces over. You can seek a variance over a certain number of parking spaces. I think it's 120% of the cap or something like that. We did allow for you to go seek a variance. There's a waiver process through the transportation management plans as well. So you can seek more parking, but the idea here is to avoid that as much as possible. As I mentioned, this does not impact structured parking, and this does not prevent the use of existing surface parking lots. So we're not asking you to tear up, existing parking. And the other piece in the parking section is we did provide basic design standards for the configuration of surface parking lots, drive aisles, space sizes. These are things in modern codes that's not in the current ordinance. We just added some basic standards so that the board has something and the developer has something to follow in terms of what we'd like to see for parking lot creation, if indeed you are doing a parking lot. And there are landscaping standards and it's screening standards as well. So there are those sections in the code. That's a little more common and traditional. So what I wanted to highlight was our approach on the minimum and maximum parking. And in addition to that, for folks that do want to do surface parking lots, we felt it was important that if you want to have spaces for cars, you should also have spaces for bikes. So in the case of new surface parking lots, you will be required to put in a certain number of bike parking spaces for any surface lot over 5 new spaces. So that will create more bike parking, safe bike parking, and we do have some standards for what safe bike parking looks like. And then in addition to that, we have long-term bike parking, which does not apply to surface parking lots. It's actually based on some uses. It's not all uses. It's certain types of uses that lend itself to requiring some long-term parking. Housing, for instance, some housing, if you have a lot of apartments, having some long-term bike parking, and that's for employees, residents, overnight parking. So we do have some modest standards for that, which is actually really popping up in a lot of codes. Although I find a lot of codes are requiring a lot of long-term bike parking, we try to be a little more practical about it, but we do have some requirements for that as well. And then we also added EV charging station allocations for surface parking lots and structured parking lots. So surface parking lots with 20 or more spaces will be asked to provide at least a minimum of 2 charging stations per 20 spaces. And then in structured parking, 10% of the structured parking should be allocated to having EV charging stations. We feel like we're trying to, have the development community looking ahead. It's a lot easier to put the conduit down for these things beforehand. We're even recommending that they have staged areas for additional EV charging stations going forward. It's not required, but the people should be thinking about that as they do new parking lots, because it's a lot easier to put some of this in place beforehand and not have to rip up things later and then install them. So we're trying to be proactive about it in these requirements. So that kind of covers our parking changes. Obviously, this is a big change from the current code. This will be interesting to see what people think of that. The other area where we didn't take a new approach, but we did really overhaul the standards, and I wanted to alert you to that, is the signage standards, which is a really long, cumbersome section in your current code. We did try to streamline that considerably. We shifted away from using the font size driven sign size that's in the current code, which doesn't really necessarily correlate to the whole size of the sign. It's just the fonts, which is a little unusual in modern signage. We used a lot more photographs to illustrate types of signs. We synthesized some of those sign standards into a 2-page table that I think amounted to at least 10 pages of narrative in the current code. We updated signage to cover things like electronic message centers and feather flags. We added standards related to window signs because that's one of those areas where things can get out of control really quickly. And in fact, we did amortize out window signage that doesn't meet the new code will be amortized to need to be removed within 6 months of the adoption of the code, really to try to rein in some of the more flagrant, often like convenience stores and places like that that have papered over their entire windows with advertisements. So, and that's sort of the reason behind that. But for the most part, this is a streamlining and trying to clear up some difficult to read sign standards that are in your current code. So that's important. Also of note, the sign size calculation will be based on one side of a sign, not two. So if it's a 2-sided sign, you only count the sign area once. That's a change, and I believe that's a change, and that's important to note because it might otherwise seem like we allow a lot more sign, that we've changed the signage in ways that we haven't. So that's just an important note. And so take a look at that because it is somewhat different, across the board in terms of how the section feels, although maybe some of the standards aren't as drastically different than what you have now. It's just been, hopefully it'll be easier to read. So that's signage. Let's see here. Okay, so this is a new section, and I just wanted to cover it briefly. Stormwater management, like I mentioned, you do have a whole code chapter in the city code on stormwater management. We felt it was important to take the state standards on stormwater management, which don't trigger some of the controls unless you've disturbed at least an acre of soil or more, which is a rather suburban standard that doesn't really apply as well in an urban environment. So we did add a more strict threshold that triggers stormwater management planning and infrastructure. And we triggered that based on impervious surface, new imperviousness, rather than disturbing an acre of land. A park could disturb an acre of land and might have no stormwater management issues. So we've moved to an imperviousness trigger, and with that also developers will be required to do an urban runoff control plan, which has standards that are reflected in the state requirements and best practices. It's just we're triggering them at a higher threshold than the state requires. So it's not creating a new set of standards. It's just triggering them at a different threshold level. So that's been put in place in the ordinance, even though it is more about stormwater management, but it absolutely affects all development plans anyway. So this will be a coordination between the city engineer and the planning commission. The city engineer obviously having to sign off on all these on the plan itself. But I did want to mention it because it is something to look for, because it will get triggered with, at a threshold that you might not be seeing currently. And the low impact development and green infrastructure practices that are required in best practices anyway will also be required for stormwater management under this scenario as well. So all of that gets triggered as it would have at the higher threshold, at the lower threshold. So that's just, that's a new and important thing we felt that we just wanted to highlight. Okay, we don't have too much more here, but one of the other sections that we wanted to spend some time on is our resilient waterfront and flood risk overlay. On the this is an overlay that is placed on the use map. You'll see it as a black line, and I'll show it to you on the next slide. Some of this will be familiar to you because it is, you sort of have a Hudson River overlay now built into your code in the way you handle development within a certain number of feet of the Hudson River, especially in the South Troy area, et cetera. So some of this will be familiar to you when you look it over. But the purpose of this is, yes, to protect the Hudson River waterfront, but also to preserve the ecosystem benefits of the river. And then a new component is planning for tomorrow's flood. So some of the things that will be more familiar to you are elements to promote public access. You do have some of this in your code now, but we are going to add a component where we're promoting a waterfront multi-use trail development for new projects. We can't require that developers add a multi-use trail or pathway along the waterfront if they're doing waterfront development, but we can strongly encourage them to include that in their new development. So we're trying to piece together a waterfront trail. And so we're integrating this with some guidance on what the parameters of that multi-use path should look like into the code. And we are asking the Planning Commission to work with developers to really, push getting this multi-use trail development into new projects where it's feasible. Not every site will be feasible, but we felt it was important to include, even though we can't outright require that, because we'd be potentially taking the land for public access. So that's a new feature. Some of the things you're more familiar with would be encouraging water dependent uses and water related uses within that waterfront area. And we cite that because these are uses that you wouldn't necessarily list in the permitted uses table, but they're, things like docks and things like that. You don't necessarily need to list in the uses table, but obviously we want to promote those uses, patios at restaurants, things like that on the waterfront. We absolutely are supportive of in the overlay. So we've included a list of those. And we're the waterfront view shed, where new development might take place, protection of the view shed for residents and also from the river should be taken into consideration. So those are some of the public access elements we're looking for. In addition to that is the ecosystem benefits. So we have set a minimum setback of 50 feet for all new development. There is an exception for replacement of existing structures. There are shoreline protection standards for clear cutting, vegetation, and other activities. We've got a list of prohibited uses that have potential environmental impacts to the river. And so we have set a 500-foot setback for those uses along most of the river. And then in the South Troy Industrial District area, we have set it at 250 feet. So you will see a list of prohibited uses in this overlay district that should be taken into account in addition to what it says on the permitted uses table. And then the other element of this is planning for tomorrow's flood. And this is where we felt it was important to try to really understand how the floodplain works in the city, how flooding works in the city to the extent that we can. We had a team specialist on our consultant team, James White, who did an analysis of Troy's existing flood maps, the insurance rate maps, the firm maps, and which date back to 1979. And they, as a result, are relatively, you would assume relatively unreliable given their age. We did find that not only are they from 1979, but some of the data is really still the same carryover data since before the Conklinville Dam was put in, which obviously directly affects the city of Troy and how water and how the river moves and floods. So as a result, of that analysis, he felt it was important to re-describe what the floodplain probably looks like in the city. So he did that as part of this project, just so we have an understanding. It doesn't replace the firm maps until somebody updates, until FEMA updates the firm maps. The 1979 maps stand, but for our purposes, it was important to really have a better understanding of what the flood zone probably really looks like in the city. So he did that effort, and then in addition to that, he looked at the new Community Risk and Resilience Act for New York State, which went into effect I think in 2018, but the guidance for looking at flood risk did not go into effect until 2020. So there are now new standards that communities are supposed to look at that address climate change and flood risk. And these guidelines are supposed to be used for projects that require permitting, excuse me, and funding in New York State. So it does have the effect, excuse me. So it will affect projects going forward, regardless of zoning and planning. But given that this is something that New York State expects communities to be looking at, we decided to get ahead of the game here and get that in place for the city of Troy as part of this process, so that they're kind of a step ahead of other communities and can kind of hit the ground running when funding sources and permitting agencies ask them if they've looked at this. So this is all part of now your flood risk overlay. And what we did was, in looking at the 100-year floodplain that exists today, the 1979 floodplain, our James Voigt actually determined that floodplain was probably a little large, and is probably a little larger than what your 100-year floodplain really is today. However, when you then factor in the climate change guidance you're supposed to now consider, and using the New York State guidelines to do that modeling, for the most part, it actually puts the floodplain back to where it is today, with a few areas where it's probably not accounted for. So you'll see on this map, these areas that are not hatched, these are areas that are likely to flood that are not accounted for in the current floodplain map. But the hatched areas with the orange underneath account for your current floodplain, and you'll see that it's very similar to what climate change is probably going to look like. So there's a good chance that when FEMA does do an update, which is supposedly happening soon for your maps, you might find that your climate change floodplain or would look very similar to the current floodplain if it was remapped. So the good news is you're probably not far off in what you've got mapped now when addressing climate change. So what we've done was mapped an overlay, which is the black line on the use map, that follows the flood risk boundary that we believe would account for most modeling for projected 100-year flood. So that's going to be on this map, and anything within that boundary will have a few some standards that apply to it, as well as the standards that we already discussed about siting projects on the Hudson River waterfront. So the couple of things that we did cover was the siting of new critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is things like utilities, emergency services, hospitals, nursing homes, and other places where people with limited mobility would have a difficult time getting out of a flooding situation. What we've recommended that those be sited outside of the overlay if possible. So not citing critical infrastructure within the overlay. If it's not possible, those facilities should be built at approximately 1 foot above what the building code currently requires for critical infrastructure. So it's a little bit of a higher elevation development scenario than current building code for critical infrastructure, about a 1 foot difference. For other, and then the other piece of that is that there should be an access route in and out from the critical infrastructure that is also at least 1 foot above required building code requirements for critical infrastructure in a flood zone. So it's a combination of building outside the flood zone by an additional foot and making sure you have an access route that meets the same requirement. And then for other new development or substantial construction, so, you know, a large addition on a project, whatever, we are recommending that any development within the flood risk overlay be 1 foot above the current building code requirement in the flood zone. So, or floodplain. So right now it's basically the term base elevation plus 2 feet. This would likely add an additional foot to that if you're in the floodplain. So those are our recommendations for this code on that. And that is based on knowing that climate change is probably going to bring those floods much more frequently, and that this is the best way to prevent against that flood damage that we are starting to see much more frequently. And you know, I live in West Sand Lake, and we had the July flood this year, and it was an incredible experience. So I saw it with my own eyes, and most of what was flooded 4 and 5, 10 feet was outside the 500-year floodplain. So it was quite something. So anyway, these are some of the things we are recommending within that overlay. This is obviously new. I should also say that the city does have a flood damage prevention chapter in its code. That is something that this could also be part of, but we felt it was important to get it in this because this is what we were working on. This could absolutely be carried over and used in correlation with the flood damage prevention plan that the city does need to update, because right now it's actually out of compliance, I believe, with FEMA requirements. So that is something that the city should look at in the future as well. So that concludes the new standards or the update to the standards section. I do have a few slides here because I am working with you here with the ZBA Planning Commission. We do have a few slides here on permitting and any updates to that I did want to go through.
Monica, I just want to jump in on the zoning map.
Yes.
One of the things we didn't mention was, I'm sure everybody's wondering, what did we do with the parcel in Lansingburg on 2nd Avenue at the very northern end of the city?
Yes, you were going to mention that at the beginning, you promised.
And I forgot to.
You want me to go back to the map?
So this, yeah, sure. This is, I don't know if you need to, but this is a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. And what we determined was that because the city council is currently reviewing that parcel, we would leave it to the city council to review. And we are leaving it as single family because we didn't want opposition to think we were trying to pull a fast one. So we're leaving it going through the same process it was. And likewise, on the flip side of that is the question will be asked then, well, if we wanted to change it, you know, why did we not change it in the zoning ordinance? And again, there was no great way to deal with this. We did not want that to be a bone of contention with the adoption of this new zoning ordinance. So we are continuing to let the city council handle that issue.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know why I went to that map. That really wasn't necessary. Okay. So for codes and review or permitting and review, code enforcement For the most part, the projects that the Director of Code Enforcement were reviewing before, they will largely continue to do so. We did expand the list of activities that are exempt from site plan review. Right now, you just have, I think, single and two-family home and customary accessory are the only things listed. We elaborated on that. We didn't really increase the uses in terms of the larger, uses themselves are for the most part, primary principal uses for the most part still go for site plan review. But we just clarified that list considerably. But for the most part, Code Enforcement Director will do the permitting for single and two family dwellings and customary accessory uses. That remains the same. They will continue to review signage, except electronic message centers and common signage, which we allowed in a limited fashion in the code, will go to the Planning Commission for a recommendation before they're approved by the Director of Code Enforcement, and common signage plans, which we have provisions for, will also go to the Planning Commission before they go to get sign off by the Director of Code Enforcement. Temporary uses and structures are not technically in your current code, are not before the Director of Code Enforcement. They're technically before the ZBA. I don't know if the Zoning Board of Appeals has ever, reviewed and approved those. There wasn't a sense of that from planning staff, but at any rate, that is not something that really should have been put on the ZBA in the first place in terms of something that is within their purview. We have shifted that to the Director of Code Enforcement where it more properly should be located. And then boundary lot and / lot line, also known as lot line adjustments, which are not in the code at all right now. But the Director of Code Enforcement was signing off on those before they go for filing with the county. So those will continue to be part of Director of Code Enforcement's purview for permitting. This assumes, of course, that variances aren't needed. So just, if everything checks out, that they'll continue to sign off on those things. And we really didn't make changes to that process. Commissioner of Planning and Planning Department will continue to coordinate all applications before the Planning Commission and ZBA. There is I would say, more role for planning staff on advisory recommendations on projects just because of the more comprehensive nature of how this is set up. And of course, there'll be continued coordination with the city engineer and code enforcement. So those roles haven't changed, although I do think there'll be more role for recommendations and advisory. The Planning Commission. So I know you've just recently had a little bit of an update to the roles in the Chapter 71 roles and makeup of the Planning Commission. The role of the Planning Commission is actually in the ordinance. So so those duties have changed a bit. We have added special use permit approvals to the Planning Commission, and I'll talk about that in a minute, as well as subdivisions. For reasons that aren't clear to me, the subdivision chapter of the city code was eliminated somewhere along the way. So for some time now, there's been no review of subdivisions by the Planning Commission, which is typically where they'd be located. I know you don't have a lot of subdivisions, but at the moment, I guess they're going to the Director of Code Enforcement and then just straight to the county. Those will now be coming back to the Planning Commission. Sorry. So that will be a new role, and we have a new section in the code on the process for reviewing those subdivisions. And as previously mentioned, the Planning Commission will review common signage plans and electronic message centers as part of any sign application, and doing a recommendation to the Director of Code Enforcement. For the Zoning Board of Appeals, the role of reviewing special permits has been shifted to the Planning Commission. So that will be an elimination of a role, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The other place where there's to highlight is the composition, powers and duties and application review process that's in the current code is quite a bit different than state guidance. So we actually overhauled that, and it's so that section is now much more reflective of what the state requirements are, and the guidance for review is relatively the same. It's pretty much the same as what's in the state code or state statute. So so that's a significant change, although I'm not sure it's much of a change from what you're actually doing as a board. But we did make sure that the code reflects what the requirements actually are. I suspect that you're probably doing what the state statute requires and not probably what's in the code, the ordinance right now. And we did remove some unnecessary meeting process guidance. Those are typically bylaws of the board and of the purview of the board and don't need to be in the code. So we removed that. Again, not sure if it's being used right now or not, but we did take that out. So those are just highlights of changes to the sections on the boards and administration of permits. On the subject of the special use permit change. So the reason this is a common trend, most communities are shifting their review of special use permits to the planning commission or planning boards. The trend started when the statutory language in New York State changed from special exceptions to special use permits. And once that happened, courts were then treating special use permits as permitted uses with some additional considerations or review for conditions and impacts, not exceptions. So there no longer were exceptions to the code, but rather another layer of basically review. And so since the Zoning Board of Appeals is supposed to be reviewing exceptions and variances, it no longer really fit their hat to be, because special use permits are not exceptions. They're permitted uses so long as you meet conditions, or so long as they're reviewed for impacts and there may be no conditions placed on them. So as a result, that's been the trend, and we are recommending that shift here as well. The good news for the process itself is that it does streamline things, because nearly all special use permits also require site plan review. So projects were going to have to go to the Planning Commission anyway. So now it would all be one seamless process of discussing the use and then the site development as one project. So that is obviously a big change. It is a very common change that most communities are making that shift. So we would recommend that, but that is obviously something up for your discussion. I think that, so, and as part of that special use permit changeover, we also updated the review process to reflect state requirements. We added the review criteria, that's actually a lot of which is in the state criteria as well, but we added it to the code so that you have, it's really important to have that review criteria in your code, because if you are placing conditions on a use, it's really important that the criteria for what the impact is stated in the code, so you can tie it back to your decision to place a condition on the use. So if it's got traffic impacts and you want to limit the number of customers or that can be at I don't know, at a venue at one time because of traffic or something like that, you can tie it back to the traffic conditions. Or if you don't want to allow truck traffic because it's on a very secondary road, street in the city, you can tie it back to, traffic impacts. So it's an important piece to have in the code. It's not in your current code. So that's a big thing to, when you're working with special use permits, it's really important to utilize that. So that's in there now. Site plan review. Not a whole lot of change to the process itself. We did add a more comprehensive list of exemptions, as I mentioned earlier. We added a checklist for site development considerations, and we updated the criteria for approval. So you'll see some changes there, but that process is largely intact. For all of the permitting processes and reviews, we added a little section on variance coordination. As you all know, if you've been, in working with projects that require variances as well as site plan review or a special use permit, it can be very cumbersome because the timing of when you seek the variance is always a little bit difficult. Do you go get the variance first and then go back to the planning board for the rest of the project? Do you start with the planning commission and then go seek the variance, and then since ultimate approval for the site plan has to happen at the planning commission, do you go back? We believe that there's no easy solution, but we believe that the best way to start things is to start at the planning commission if it requires site plan review. And because you want to make sure that the project doesn't ultimately need more variances, or if there's something that wasn't looked at prior to going and seeking the variances. So you can clarify what the variances will be. You can make sure everybody's on the same page on the project, then send them off to the ZBA for the variances that have been identified by code enforcement. ZBA goes through the process of figuring those out and then sends it back to the planning commission. And then they go back to the planning commission to finish up site plan review or special use permit subdivision, whichever the project is. We feel like that's probably the best process, although there's nothing perfect. So we have worked that into the code so that everyone sort of does the projects all the same way. Obviously, there might be a situation where that doesn't quite work perfectly, but we think it's the best scenario. So we did provide guidance on that. And then lastly, on public hearings, we updated that process. So in terms of notifications, because the process was kind of all over the lot, and a process that I don't think was very helpful or common for noticing public hearings. So first of all, a public hearing shouldn't be set until a board is in agreement that the application is complete. So you're setting a public hearing not before the person comes into has ever come before the board, because then there can be things that change within the application, and you really shouldn't be having a public hearing until the application is complete and people can review what you're actually considering approving. So we would recommend a first meeting, deciding the application is complete, then you set the public hearing, because that actually starts the state clock for all reviews. So that we've clarified that in a couple of places in the code, that's the process that is really laid out in state law, and we would recommend that you're following that. But separate from that, then the notification of public hearings will now be to property owners within 100 feet of the applicant property. They'll be done by mail, by the clerk or city staff will just do mailings as opposed to the papering of neighbors or however that's been working. So we're just going to go to a straight mailing to applicants using the assessor's database for who's within 100 feet of the property. And that's a pretty straightforward process that a lot of communities use. Either they use adjacent property owners or 100 feet. So we set that process for all public hearings going forward. Okay, and this is the last of these slides. Boundary line adjustments have a section in the code now. For the most part, they're not going to come before you. They're going to just go to Director of Code Enforcement. If a project is going to create a new buildable lot or creates a nonconformity, the nonconformity will trigger a variance, obviously. If it's going to create a new buildable lot by moving that lot line, then it would go to the Planning Commission for a recommendation or approval before it goes, instead of the Director of Code Enforcement. Subdivision, as I mentioned, will be reviewed by the Planning Commission, and we did set a whole process out for you. We streamlined it as much as humanly possible because it can be rather cumbersome in the state statute. So we made one process for all subdivisions. And hopefully you'll find it user-friendly when you read through that. But if you haven't been doing those for a while, or I don't know when the Planning Commission was reviewing, that might be a new thing. I don't know how many subdivisions you really see a year. It might be 1 or 2. But anyway, that process is new. Planned development districts, we updated the process to try to make it a little more clear. It was kind of light in the current, it's kind of light in the current code. So we added language to that, and we established some goals and criteria for considering PDDs. But for the most part, that is a tool you have now. It's obviously being used. So we've just sort of spelled out the process more, but it's not different than what you do now. So it's the same process. We've just actually added the language into the code. All right, and then lastly, non-conforming lots, structures, and uses. This is a section in your code now. A good portion of what you have in there is standard language. Just to summarize what we've done with this. So if you're a non-conforming lot, existing non-conforming lot, it can be built on as long as all development standards can be met, besides the fact that whatever the nonconformity is. If other standards can be met, it can be built upon, and you can move forward. With no minimum lot size and some of the other things being eliminated, I'm not sure how much this is going to come up anymore, to be honest. Non-conforming lots may be kind of going by the wayside. Non-conforming structures, if a non-conforming structure is destroyed by fire, damage, et cetera, that language, it may still be rebuilt in the same footprint as before. The only new statement there is that new development standards regarding height, the minimum and maximum height standards, and architectural development standards would have to be met. She wouldn't have to meet, other standards just as before, but the new building should look more like the new standards are looking for, in terms of height and architectural development. So that is a change. And then with regard to non-conforming uses, which is the one that, may not come up any more than now. We didn't tinker with a lot of that too much. I don't know how much. I think I'm sure you've created a few new non-conforming uses in the new code, but I think for the most part, we tried to be relatively respectful to current uses. They may remain operational, they follow the land, not the owner. That's, how things exist today. We have said that you can expand within the existing structure. This is not spelled out in your current code. So we are allowing so you could be a use that's only using a portion of a building, and it may be a non-conforming use. We are saying you could expand within that structure. You can't expand the structure with the use, but within that existing structure, you could expand the use in that building. But if it's an outdoor use, you cannot expand that. So outdoor uses cannot be expanded if they're not conforming. And then you are allowed to rebuild as long as damage does not exceed 75% of fair market value should the use be destroyed by natural causes, fire, et cetera, which I think is in the code now. And then as it reads now, if the use is discontinued for 12 months, it may not be resumed. New language that we added defines what constitutes being in operation during. So you have folks that do an end run around this by turning on the lights or the utility for a week and then say, oh, I'm still in operation. And so to button that up, we are saying that use is operational if it's within use for 60 days within a 12-month period, so that somebody cannot come in and just turn the lights on for a week and then say, well, I'm still operational. So that language is intended to button that up. So I think that is the end of the review of the standards. And, I wanted to just leave you with how we address sustainability and just recapping the things we talked about, because a lot of codes are asked, how are you meeting the principles of sustainability? And that's a very common question. And so I would just leave, I think we've done a lot with this code to hit that. And just to highlight some of the ways in which, I would consider this code to be meeting, the sustainability principles. We've definitely many more areas are promoting, we've promoted mixed use neighborhoods, places to live, work, and play, that sort of, that theme of, mixed use buildings and mixed use neighborhoods. Many of which are mixed use today, or were traditionally mixed use, and we're bringing back support for that. Infill development is promoted with flexibility and increased density opportunities. That's certainly, more efficient land use. Those are sort of themes of sustainability. Protecting neighborhood character and design through building form and site development standards, placemaking, maintaining character, all part of sustainability. Support for local food access, and urban agriculture. I think this code's very strong in this regard. We've introduced urban farming nearly citywide at some level. We are supportive of personal agriculture with standards in there. It's listed in the table of uses as a permitted use. We've opened up areas where grocery stores are permitted. So you'll in that we do have requirements for fresh food and fresh produce for both grocery stores and convenience stores. So while yes, you can have a grocery store, and you can have a convenience store still in many locations, that needs to be a much more significant component for convenience stores than currently. Grocery stores, it's just reinforcing that to make sure they're actually grocery stores.
We've also limited, if you want to talk a minute about dollar stores,
Yes, that's true. Dollar stores are actually hurting the ability to cite grocery stores, because a lot of the non-food items that dollar stores sell are actually important to the bottom line of grocery stores. So urban areas are especially having a hard time where there's a dollar store on every corner, then being able to make the numbers work to then cite their grocery store. So we have put in place, we've called them small box variety stores. I did not come up with that. That was a lot of research. And we've lined them out on the table. We do allow them in, several districts. So, good portion of the city does still allow dollar stores, but we did put a distance requirement between them so that they're not to sort of disperse them a little bit more. And we reined in some of the districts in which they're allowed to be located. So trying to just open up avenues for grocery stores while still recognizing that there's a place for dollar stores and they do serve a purpose. So we tried to thread that needle a bit. So that's something to look. We still allow convenience stores, but there is a significant portion of the store that would have to be devoted to food. So that's also a significant change for convenience stores. There was a provision in before, but it was very loose. So we tightened that up considerably. So housing diversity and affordability. We support accessory dwelling units and single family neighborhoods. That's a new piece. We removed the minimum square footage for dwelling units, deferring to the building code instead, because the building code, it's, there's requirements for bedrooms, et cetera. So we don't feel that needs to be in this code, and also therefore removes any of the density caps that are typical in zoning, so that adds flexibility. We removed the minimum lot size requirements, the automatic minimum parking standards. So parking can be an expensive component. Working with minimum lot sizes and density, all that flexibility should improve affordable housing options for, within the city for infill site redevelopment. And even adaptive reuse of buildings, because you won't have that density cap. We allow for a diversity of housing types in the multifamily and mixed use neighborhoods. A good portion of the city is mixed use. And we, are fairly open to most housing types within those areas. Co-housing and things like that are all defined under one general definition. So you'll see that in there, but, we don't line them all out on the table, but they're allowed. The more modern, interesting housing types are welcome in all of those areas. In terms of protection of natural resources and natural function, we've got the stream and wetland shoreline protection standards, steep slopes standards, conservation and enhancement of native landscaping is in the code. We've even got language regarding use of pollinators for habitat enhancement for all new landscaping. We do have significant standards in there, most of which are just to provide guidance, not so much the girth of the amount of landscaping you have to do, but making sure it's quality landscaping. Control for a new imperviousness, those stormwater management practices that we talked about, and the new threshold for meeting the stormwater management standards, requiring low impact development and green infrastructure are there as well. We support alternative transportation uses and reduce fossil fuels by having allowing for more flexible development, high density development on infill sites, especially along the bus transit routes and stops. We did look at the new CDTA lines and make sure that where we were zoning those areas, we were thinking about the mix of development and density where those routes and stops are most prevalent. We capped the amount of new surface parking, therefore discouraging, cars and everything revolving around cars. We require pedestrian amenities and infrastructure for projects, bike parking, EVs, charging stations. And we do include solar. There's solar standards, solar's on the table as a permitted use. Windmills, if you can cite them, obviously it's going to be somewhat constrained in an urban environment, but individual windmills could theoretically be cited if you can meet site standards. Geothermal are all supported in the code. And lastly, we've got our climate change adjusted flood damage mitigation requirements, the flood risk overlay, which is a really important piece, and that will be utilized to address new development and critical infrastructure. And I think the city will be ahead of the game on that piece, in terms of what we're seeing in other codes. So I'm really excited about that piece. So that, in conclusion, at the, I beat the 8 o'clock mark. All right. that is my spiel of our zoning update. Steve, I'm not sure. I'm going to just stop the share unless you think I should leave this up. I mean, I know.
Why don't you leave it up, because otherwise you're just looking at, well, you could leave, yeah. Why don't you stop the share and at least people can see the names. So now we'll open it up for questions from the commissions, and I would like to congratulate you. We do have, with one note from a doctor, 100% attendance from our 3 boards. So thank you for that.
Oh, very good. All right.
Yeah. We did receive a number of questions from the public. Again, I wanted to keep this kind of the 10,000 foot view. Some of the questions were specific. Many of them Aaron and I answered, and I see that there's more coming up, but there will be many more meetings at which the public will have a chance to first view the ordinance and then ask questions as well. So that said, are there questions from the commissioners?
Yes, Steve, this is Wally from the Historic Review Commission. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yep.
I noticed that in Lansingburg, in the area of the old downtown, that is not a designated downtown mixed use. what's the thinking behind that?
So it is designated neighborhood 4, which is a fairly dense character. The way it lays out, and I don't, let's see, is that one of the ones I think I do have? Let me just share my screen again, because I think that was one of the slides. The neighborhood 4 is, does allow for 4-story build to the lot line, required, build to the street frontage, very shallow setbacks, if any. You can have shared street walls. So I do think that I'm just seeing here if neighborhood 4 is one of mine here, but I don't know that I'll be able to, I would have to probably go into the code itself. It's right here, but so, the intention is still to be an urban, it's a fairly urban character. It's just not as urban as 7 stories, 100% build out the way downtown is. But a lot of the characteristics are similar. It's mostly a height difference, not so much a scale and build out difference between the two characters, to be honest with you. So I think was most of our thought, was just that the scale of the buildings in downtown in terms of height is where there's a divergence from what you'd probably want to see in Lansingburg. But if you take a look at neighborhood 4, I think you'll see the build out is fairly, it's fairly dense and quite flexible for what we hope you'd want to see up there, especially on the northern drive, that corridor, which definitely could use some redevelopment.
Okay, and just a follow-up question with respect to the downtown mixed-use area as it applies to the downtown Troy area, which is mostly in an historic district. I noticed the full build-out height allowable is going up to, if I read correctly, 8 stories. I'm wondering in which context, and I know that there are considerations for, say, relationship to the height of adjacent buildings and that kind of thing, but in which context in the downtown area do you imagine that 8-story buildings would be constructed?
I don't know. I think we were, I believe right now, I believe it's, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, is it 7 stories, or somebody can correct me? Is it 7 stories or 8 stories now for downtown? I think we were feeling like,
I think
sorry,
we're 8 right now, aren't we?
yeah, I think we maintain that. I think the idea was, downtown is built out. The only real place to go is up. So maintaining that 8 stories, seemed okay, because you don't not that you have those now, but it is something that has been permissible. And I know when we did the One Monument Square charrette, portions of that project got fairly tall, and if done well, people seem to respond fairly positively to it. So I think it depends upon what that looks like and how that would build out. But in terms of where I envision it per se, frankly, I think One Monument Square is the only place I've seen it actually visualized, and it was very attractive, but it was a small.
I would say for the most part, it's going to be 6th Avenue. There's not a lot of sites left.
Yeah.
But the reason why I ask is because I wonder, in particular, say, for example, the site, in that block between Congress and State Street on 4th, where there is a kind of an agglomeration of lots that have come on and off the market. And to me, it looks like, that person, not to single them out, but they're kind of assembling a lot for a future large-scale development, but that there are two-story buildings that exist already that are contributing to the historic district that are within that that assembled parcel. And so I wonder if and I don't know that this is necessarily going to do this, but I wonder if there might be a way to address the possibility of development pressures when people assemble parcels, with the goal of building a large scale building. I'm just wondering if there's undue pressure on the removal of small scale buildings that are taken up by these kind of agglomeration of lots in these situations. It's not out of the question when you think about people looking to add in order to make a development feasible, looking to add adjacent lots on which there are buildings that are still standing. So I'm wondering how we might go about kind of disincentivizing that kind of an activity.
You're talking about disincentivizing the
accumulation of what might be perceived to be underbuilt lots, but which actually have historic structures standing on them at present, like when they're adjacent to large lots that are ideal for, or almost ideal for, development of larger structures, but which they need additional space in order to make the project feasible. I'm kind of worried about the the erosion of some of the streetscape and the historic district by just the slow accumulation and the what's it called, demolition by neglect, which has happened in the past of people who are assembling larger parcels with the idea for future development.
Well, I mean, I really feel that, I mean, in the downtown, where you have to go before planning commission to get a demolition and everything is historic, I don't see that happening as much now, and I could be wrong, but you have limited lot sizes now that are going to be constrained by parking anyways, and I get what you're saying, but I don't think we have a lot of history of that right now. The most recent one, even Vicina, was tearing down a bank.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It hasn't been an issue. I just kind of knowing some of the that the larger there are a decreasing number of available larger lots that permit the kind of the development that kind of crests over the threshold that some developers like to. So I can foresee, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that in the future there will be additional kind of assemblages of lots that are partially currently built on, and there will be asks. I'm just trying to keep it in mind. I think it's not unreasonable to think that that's going to happen. It certainly happens in we see it all over the place in in Brooklyn and other places where you ultimately have the removal, and it's happened to some degree in Schenectady as well, where really at this point in terms
but it's only happening. It's not happening in historic districts. Downtown is almost universally a historic district, has protections.
Yeah,
has secret protections as well. So yeah. I totally understand what you're saying, but
it has actually happened in Schenectady. I mean, even though there's the majority of the historic district is now gone on State Street in Schenectady.
Well, there is, but again, there is no historic district on State Street in Schenectady. Yes, it's historic, but it has no historic protection. So that's how that has happened and continues to happen in Schenectady. And in Troy, we have historic districts throughout downtown, which puts that extra layer of protection on top. So we're not going to see what's happening in Schenectady, in Troy, outside of the downtown. Yes, when you get to the other side, Federal Street, obviously, you know, that's where you start to see it. And until we get historic protections there, I don't see it happening.
Yeah, I'm not, and as I say, I didn't mean to call out that that one potential developer, because I don't know what plans are. And I also, I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate, a concern that comes up in my head.
And again, I'll just say, I think it's the historic district protection that we have that prohibits that from happening.
The other thing too, like on the edges of, I believe you mentioned Congress Street. So we did include, so downtown edge starts, we were actually thinking about the step down of being careful to look at the scale at the edges of downtown, because things do start to step down, and making sure that we, do change that scale and gradually move away from the downtown. So that's what that downtown edge scale represents. And so you will see some decrease in height, for a few blocks as you're heading out of downtown, and you segue to the more neighborhood scale, 3-story, 2-story neighborhoods that are more common. And that was also to add some protection to those existing neighborhoods where you want to maintain still a scale greater than regular residential neighborhoods, but recognizing that you don't have that downtown scale, and you don't want the development pressures to build those, to take those down and build at a different level. But I do agree with Steve, having the demolition review requirement is just a really, it just, if nothing else, it just creates a lot of paperwork and headaches and things that people will, developers will shy away from wanting to take on. So I do think you have more protections in Troy than you do in a lot of communities.
All right, thank you. I think you did a great job.
Thank you. And by the way, anybody that wants to, we can provide our contact information too, but obviously this process, I know there'll be more questions here, but we'll be happy to answer, other individual question type things through email if things come up with the boards, because I know you're pretty important players in this. So I'm happy to share my email and take questions that way too, if people have questions after the fact. I just wanted to mention that because I didn't put it up on the screen, but I'm happy to share that at the end here.
Hey, Margaret, this is Roddy Yeagan on the Planning Commission. This is a question for either you or Steve, if that's pointed or specific, but I guess, could you speak a little bit about the thought that went into placemaking or the public spaces and ways that people connect through the city, and how the code was remodeled or revisited on those topics?
Steve, you want me to go?
Yeah, please.
So we do have a placemaking component. Placemaking, especially in public spaces, is a little tougher in zoning because it's public realm and you're dealing with private property owners. And I'm going to let Lawrence Howard, you're on this meeting, and so please chime in to back me up on this. But we do in some ways, zoning has to be somewhat separated from how much we can do with the public realm within zoning, because it's telling private property owners what they will allow the public to do on their property. So
I will jump in, Monica. This is Lawrence Howard, and I've been here through all of tonight, but also through all of this process. But I think that the answer to your question is really in the map that's still being shown right here. The way this code has addressed the intensity of development in the city was done by, our urban design team that we had with us, and they're not here tonight, but the way these development intensity zones were laid out was with a lot of thought to how that will affect the spaces in the city and how the city is used. And the innovation, one of the big innovations in this code, is separating that from the uses, to say there's a lot of places where we might want certain uses, but we don't always want the same density or intensity of development in all of those places. But if you take a closer look, or do please take a closer look at this development intensity map, because I think that that's intentionally going a long way towards shaping the places. And of course, as Monica said, we can't dictate, the actual public spaces, but by controlling the density of these private spaces, we think we're going a long way towards helping that placemaking idea.
And we did also include, and we do have a component in the code, and if I stop my share, well, I don't want to necessarily stop my share. There's a section in the code under the supplemental regulations. There's a placemaking component where we do ask developers to, for new projects, to include placemaking elements within their project. And so we are expecting them to come up with things. What we did not do is prescribe exactly what they need to do. And part of that is because if you tell everyone they have to put either a bench or a bike rack or a public art or a sculpture, and you dictate these things, you can really actually end up with a lot of clutter. And I actually have had anecdotal experiences where in other communities, which shall remain nameless, who have had some of these things put in place where it can actually, become more, it's not handled with all practicality. And so what we're hoping by including this, recognizing that some of it might be asking the private sector to do some public things here, is to try to get them to do it anyway. So we do have a placemaking component. It is in the supplemental regulations, and we hope the Planning Commission will, will use that and ask developers as part of site plan, what's your placemaking element, and if they're built to the street wall and they don't have any space other than what would be the middle of the sidewalk to put a placemaking element, and they choose not to put something on the wall of their building that will be placemaking or doing something else, and they can't really fit it. We don't want to create an impracticality, and they can just make the case for why that doesn't work, and I think the Planning Commission will use their judgment on that. But we do include it, but it's not a requirement, it's a want. So it's one of those more guidance pieces to try to get some of those elements and get the discussion going with developers about what can you do to make your project special and enhance that corner you're on or that neighborhood you want to locate in, and things like that. So whether it's additional landscaping or trees or street furniture, et cetera. So we are asking for that, but it's not a straight out requirement in the code, but it is in the supplemental regulations. It's got its own section number, and I just don't know it off the top of my head.
Well,
But take a look at that and see what you think.
Awesome. Thanks, Monica. And thank you, Lee, for those answers. Also, I saw earlier in your presentation, there was a checklist, I think, mentioned for the planning commissioners. Is that literally a physical or, a document that's going to be available for us to go through and look at for what criteria we should be considering at each application?
Yeah, I think so. Right now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's like I think the way it goes right now, right? The Planning Commission is supposed to have its own checklist, and whether or not it exists, I'm not sure. But so what we included in the code was not the physical checklist, but basically the list of things you're supposed to be reviewing for. What I would recommend is that does get converted into a checklist that you do use if possible, because sometimes it's just hard to keep track of all the things you should be thinking about, especially in the moment.
Yep.
Or as
And
you're reviewing from your house and you're looking at things and so it is helpful to have those. So I would recommend that I think there might be one now, and I don't know, that you guys use, but it's maybe of your own making. What we just put in the code was to basically just kind of reinforce having that, and these are the things you should be looking at. But I would recommend, and we can certainly help with creating that for for you. And then I would recommend updating it as things change that, you know.
And I'll just add, Monica, that's something usually staff is looking at, and certainly the planning commission has helped to develop that checklist over time. But
Yep.
that is, yeah, something everybody should be looking at, but usually the staff is looking at to make sure we have a lot of those elements there and putting them in staff comments. But yes, it's something everybody should be looking at.
Well, thanks again, Monica. Thanks, Steve. Great
you.
work. Honestly, really good.
Great.
Okay, any other questions?
Steve, it's Sarah Wengert, and I have a question, and it is around the parks and conservation areas. I'm wondering what qualifies land to be park and or conservation, and do you think through your process you maximized those areas? Because although we have some very large parks, we don't have a lot of neighborhood parks. And I don't know how you would do it. Is there a way to deem chronically undeveloped parcels as conservation?
Well, and actually, and as I'm looking at the map on the screen that's up right now, so we did take a lot of undeveloped areas and initially had made them parks and conservation areas. And actually, I'm still looking up. It looks like there's a couple at the very top of the map.
So this is,
That-
you know what, this is not the.
This is the old map, isn't it?
No, you want this one.
Oh, thank you. You're right. I'm looking at the intensity zone map. Okay, so we did correct this there.
Yeah.
Right. So we did look at what was city controlled already. And wherever we could, we did try and increase the conservation and recreation space. There were certain areas that we did want to include as well. For instance, at the bottom of the map on the right, down between Hill and Morrison, that whole land west of College Suites, we wanted to make that conservation recreation, but it's privately owned. So that's really a taking to all of a sudden to say to this developer, your land is no longer developable. And even as if you look up on Route 2, out on all that green on Route 2, and you see that one little planned development district that juts down in, thank you, right there. We wanted to make that conservation as well, but it's privately owned. You can't just change it like that unless the owner is going to designate that parkland. We also had considered we didn't take every single park we have and make it a conservation district, because most of them are protected anyways, just by the very nature that they're parks. But I'm not sure, you know.
I think most
We
of them
did-
are covered though. I think
Most of them are, yes.
Yeah. But Steve, just to interject on they're protected because under the New York State Parkland Alienation Act, those once a community uses a piece of land, even if they don't call it a park, once they use it as a park, or it's used for community use that is park-like in nature or recreation, the state basically deems that to be parkland, and to undo that, you have to go through a legislative act to undo that as parks. So there's actually a lot of protection for your parks, whether we zone them conservation recreation or not. We did put that zoning on there to the extent that we could find them, or made sense. So I think most of them are covered, but whether they're covered in zoning or not, if we put them in a residential district, they cannot be converted to residential very easily, or whatever uses are allowed in a residential zoning district very easily at all. So I just throw that in, that the protections are pretty strong outside of the city.
But
City's control.
actually, to your point though, Sarah, and I'm looking at the very bottom of the map down by Stowe, there are city parcels there at the very bottom of the map that are brown, that I think we had talked initially about making those protected. And it's hard when you're looking at 16,000 parcels to remember every one. but
Okay.
I think we should look at maybe those as well. Or maybe the planning commission wants to look at what is city owned. And that would be easy enough to provide you a map and see what other protections you might want to add in.
I'd really like to see that. Thank you very much, Steve and Monica. Fabulous. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Barbara Higbee. Can you
Hi,
hear me
Barb.
okay? Hi.
Yep.
Uh, I just want to say a couple things. One is I'm very impressed with the work you've done. It's going in leaps and bounds from, you say the 80s, but I think it was really maybe more like the 60s. So I'm very impressed with how comprehensive the job is you've done. I do, of course, have a couple concerns, and I'm just going to concentrate on those. And that is in the downtown core and the downtown edge. I'm concerned that you're proposing an 8-story height as of right. And I've always understood in planning that you really shouldn't make the height as high as anybody might want to do it. What you reserve some power to your zoning Board of Appeals that can grant an exception when it's warranted and when it fits. So the one thing is the whole idea of picking 8 as opposed to what has been really sort of the limit in new construction to date, and that is 5. And then the other thought on this is the block and street level. You mentioned that you've gone through this very carefully at the block and street level. So and I think you have. I'm just asking that in the downtown core and downtown edge, you would look again, because there are many blocks that are historic, like 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th in the downtown, and many blocks that are not historic, but that are also in that inner core. And so I would like to have you look at the actual map and look at 8 stories as of right, whether that's a wise thing to do, because it seems like it's better for the city to have the control than for it to be just, oh, it's historic, which, as we know, they're not all historic. And the zoning, my understanding, the zoning could approve an appeal on that. And Lawrence, do you have any comment on that as to whether there's something that's wrong with it? And just before you answer that, I am very in favor of the Monument Square project. And I think, and I can't remember what the height is, but I just, the way it's designed, I love it just like that. I would think that that is a special project and that would have been approved in any event because it's Monument Square. But if that size pops up not all over, in other places, it would be destructive of neighborhood context, light and air for the neighbors. It would be a very damaging thing. And I think we need to keep better control on that.
And those are,
I can speak to it a little bit, Steve, before you jump in, and just to say that I don't have an opinion personally on the 8-story question. And so I'll leave that to the people with better or stronger knowledge and better opinions about that. But I will say that we did very carefully consider the notion of incentives for getting those extra stories. And frankly, with a lot of experience, those don't tend to work very well. Leaving it for the Zoning Board of Appeals for an exception, if that's what you're suggesting, is not the right approach. We shouldn't be planning for zoning board appeals exceptions. But the way that it could work is with incentives, and we, through a lot of experience, have determined that it's not a very effective route. And again, I'm going to leave the answer on the 8 stories to Steve and Monica and other people who have a lot more direct experience in the downtown.
and I would say, Barb, those are really good points. Let me ask Monica, on our design guidelines where we talk about transitions, does that give an extra level of protection?
It does. I mean, it would depend upon the scenario. I mean,
Yeah.
I can think of some examples that you're kind of currently seeing where the original, not to name a project, but you have had a project before you where the original jumped many stories very quickly without any transition, and they've proposed something that has more transition. That's certainly what you're more going for. I think that I think the transition in our minds was downtown to downtown edge, and whether there are areas that maybe should be more downtown edge, which is only, actually can't read this on the screen, but I think that's 5 stories. So, you know, maybe there's more places where that should be considered. But, you know, I would just to echo what Tig just said, or Lawrence just said about the, you know, the variance process is supposed to be seeking relief. And I don't know what the mechanism would be for somebody to say why they couldn't build, you know, they'd really have, I think they'd struggle to meet the criteria for what's supposed to grant a variance. So I would agree with Lawrence that shouldn't be how we plan for this. And so I think your other 2 options are, if you can put some incentives in place. I agree that they tend to not be particularly effective. But if you found some things that, you know, you really felt this is what you'd have to be willing to do to get an 8-story building, and you could find somebody that was willing to do that, you know, certainly that's an option to lower the height and put something in place. It's just that the markets and the what are we incentivizing exactly, and if you make it too easy, then everyone might just as well be able to build to 8 stories. And if you make it too restrictive, I don't think they really work. I agree with Lawrence on that. So I think that leaves us with my practical opinion would be, you know, figure out what the acceptable, you know, heights are and put them in place rather than trying to finagle it with incentives or a variance process. If, you know, if we haven't hit the mark, let's try to get closer to hitting the mark. We have the tools. We have a couple of different scale options here. We have downtown edge and downtown core, and perhaps there's some places where downtown edge would be a more preferable scale. You know, I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm throwing that out there without diving deeply into it, or, you know, just.
Okay, that's very helpful. So I guess the questions that come up is, that's why I started with looking at the map, street and block, at the downtown edge versus downtown core, and not only at the north end, but also at that Congress Street ferry site. But I'm a little confused by the idea that when you're using the word incentivize people, that, oh, we'll let you go to 8 stories if there's something that you do that makes us more happy. I just have the feeling that if we do go to 8, even in the core, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, that if we do go to 8, even at the core, we've given up too much, and it's very, very hard to reverse that. Then you end up with people saying, oh, there's a taking. You're trying to, you know, reel it back now. So I would really suggest, even if it's not 8, again, I'm thinking 5. Someone could say 6. 8 is really, really high. It's very tall, and it's very disruptive of the context in the downtown. Many of us last night watched the first episode of Gilded Age, and there wasn't too much of Troy yet, but it is a very big historic context that we have, and anything taller than 5 stories popping up around would be very disruptive of that. So I think we should really look at it very, very carefully. I guess that's it. Thank you.
Barb, it's good points. I would say look again at the design guidelines. Take another look at that, and certainly open to discussion on any of this. I mean, this is just a draft, and that's why I think I had said that I saw most of the larger development on 6th, because
Yep.
that's where you have the space.
Yep.
That's, you know, and anywhere else in there, if you're going to go 8 stories, you need a heck of a lot of parking, and it's not like you're going to be doing demolition. I think it's going to be hard to build 8 anywhere on 5th Avenue or 4th.
Yeah. And I agree with you about 6th Avenue, but again, that's look at block by street and street and really parse it out, because you're risking a lot of damage to our downtown the way it is now.
One thing I think we want to be careful to not do is cookie cutter it so that one block is one and one, you know, we'd like, because we want to create some cohesion or certainly transition. So, you know, I think what maybe we should look at is from the inside out, how that transition out might might maybe need to be tweaked from downtown edge, or, if downtown core, if 8 is too tall anywhere, that's one thing. But if it's then a using of the tools we have of the downtown core versus downtown edge, for instance, I would recommend that maybe we look at it from a, so that we're not bopping back and forth, certainly, just to react to exactly what's there. I think we have to be a little careful to more transition than.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, all right, that's very helpful.
All right.
Hi, this is Anthony Moen from the Planning Commission. Related to the earlier comment about Lansingburg, I was actually looking specifically at South Troy and had a similar thought that looking at the new map, proposed map, much of South Troy is classified multifamily. And, I think there's a lot of great stuff in what you guys have done here, and particularly in the expanded use of mixed use zoning. And I wonder why so much of South Troy, which, could have a walkable urban feel, excludes uses that I think would be perfectly appropriate given the context. For example, grocery stores, cafes, all of the stuff that would make, that would further the city's goals of creating sustainable urban neighborhoods where people would not have to use cars to, access those basic amenities. And it seems like the same issue that was identified in Lansingburg is also present in South Troy, where those uses are excluded.
So we did actually spend a lot of time bopping back and forth on what to do about South Troy. So the light blue corridor, so Route 4, when we settled on it, we thought that the fact, it's just the nature of the narrow stretch. So when we looked at Route 4, we said, okay, that is a place that has a mix of uses. It's it's less conducive to housing, is more likely some place that might turn over to more commercial. So we did purposefully zone all of that mixed use, which it is not currently. Most of that is zoned just residential in the current zoning. So that is almost an entire changeover to mixed use. And I think what we felt was that, and then at the northern end of South Troy, South Central, we do have, of course, some mixed use areas just north of the canal. We transitioned to more mixed use for a while. I think our thought, correct me if I'm wrong, but our thought was you could get to the route, just thinking about walkability. We didn't want to dilute every place. We wanted to make sure we created nodes of mixed use and concentrations of places to walk to instead of just scattered site, which would dilute from an economic development standpoint. It kind of dilutes that placemaking and that desire to cite a mix of uses with other mix of uses. So we were careful to try to consider corridors or nodes as opposed to just even though there may be scattered mixed use throughout some of these areas, trying to think about what would work economically and what would be more attractive to trying to getting some businesses and neighborhood shops, et cetera. So we were focusing on creating nodes or corridors where it just made sense.
We also had a lot of discussions with like the Little Italy neighborhood people talking about the fact that, there used to be corner stores, there used to be all these little amenities within their neighborhood. And obviously we're balancing this against people's dislike for certain types of convenience stores, but we did increase the number even within the multifamily, I believe it was, the ability to have certain corner commercial uses within the multifamily.
We took that out, Steve.
Did we take that out?
Yeah.
Great, okay.
But I think, so, I mean, that was our thought process on South Troy was, you've got the area north of the canal and you've got the whole Route 4 corridor would be open to that. And, certainly open to, and then the waterfront is mixed use. So we kind of felt like if you start sprinkling in nodes when you're already only a few blocks wide, are we diluting the idea of concentrating things? So that was kind of why we sort of peeled back from some of our initial thoughts, which was we were looking to maybe make that more mixed use. Because ultimately between the waterfront being mixed use and Route 4 and then, north of the canal, it just didn't seem like as many blocks that you couldn't walk 2 blocks. Yes, it's not around your corner, but is it really that far to walk to some of those places was our thought.
And there's certainly a smattering of grandfathered uses throughout that
Right.
district anyways that can be reused as
Right.
commercial uses. That nothing gets, everything that's grandfathered is grandfathered.
Yes, that's true. So
Does
I mean,
that
that
count
was our thought.
for, sorry, do the grandfather uses count for things that had in the past been in use as a prohibited use, but not for some time? Because that's my other fear, is that you've got a lot of, vacant storefronts that have been converted into some other kind of use or just left vacant for a long time. And those are never coming back unless that allows a grandfather.
Yeah, as Monica pointed out earlier, if it's unused for 12 months, then the particular area, if it's not permitted in the new zoning, particular structure or building or site would not be allowed to be reused for the commercial. So
However, if it's got
What-
unique characteristics about it, it's certainly eligible for a use variance depending on the circumstances.
but just
Yeah,
to
I mean,
reiterate, Monica was saying before, we did look at walkability, and when you can zoom in more closely on that area that she was just describing, you will see that you are actually rarely going to be more than 2 blocks away from the potential for commercial. It doesn't mean it's there, but under this proposed zoning, it could be there. So.
Well, I think reflecting Steve's comment that even he thought that under an earlier version of this, that there was more allowance for those uses under the multifamily. I guess I'd like to see more, the mixed use expanded even to cover more of those areas, because I really don't see why those uses need to be separated out to create those walkable neighborhoods, particularly, thinking about Fourth in particular. Fourth is not really the most pedestrian friendly street for long stretches of it, since it does tend to be pretty high traffic. And I think the more walkable core of that neighborhood is really along the interior streets where, where there could be viable uses that people would then be encouraged to use if they're right in the center of their neighborhood. So that's just a comment. I think it'd be good to see more of that. Thanks.
Did you have, I just out of curiosity, so when we did have more mixed use and we sort of were allowing like on corners, what's difficult is then deciding what those uses are, and where we had the mixed use district, we were thinking that it would be something scaled back. So but coming up with that that list of what's allowed on the corners got tricky quickly, which was also part of, the committee. We talked about this and we walked through some of the uses, and once we all started talking about it, some, committee members like, well, I wouldn't actually want that next to, right next to my house. And, because the corners come up quickly. So, there are a lot of corners. So it was, once we looked at it from if every corner allowed that, would you want that on every corner? Because theoretically that's what you'd be allowing. That's where we found it maybe was too much. And so that was also just as you're thinking about it, one of the other things that we at the committee level, when we were talking about it, it seemed that's where we started to wonder if we were maybe better off finding nodes where we could just use the mixed use district as a whole. So that's sort of how we ended up pulling back from the corner scenario. So just that's more background on that, but we can certainly take a look at some things some more.
Hi, this is Suzanne from the Planning Commission. I just wanted to commend everyone for doing such a great job. It's really impressive, and as someone who lives in North Central, which is full of undeveloped land, vacant lots, and opportunities for infill housing, I'm really looking forward to see how the new regulations will allow people to actually build on all these lots that have been left empty because you weren't allowed to build on them before. I'm thinking, some version of tiny houses or a little bigger than tiny houses and other kinds of housing that will be able to be built here. So it's really encouraging, and thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Still open for any other questions. And I know we had, well, are there any other questions or comments?
I'm going to stop my share.
Okay, well, then I'll say thank you to everyone. Thank you for the public. We had a great showing of the public, and I know we did answer some questions. Certainly, there's more chance for you to ask questions. You can email us if you would like, or stop in and see us and ask questions. And we should be, I think we're talking about having our first meeting in a public meeting, I think in the second week of February.
I think
Potentially. So stay tuned for that. We'll send out an announcement and we will get the ordinance posted before that so people can review it before that occurs. And thank you. It has been a great process. I really think we have the great workings of a good, clear, concise zoning ordinance that really benefits the city and doesn't confuse the planning commission and the zoning board and staff and the public and developers as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for participating. And I will, Steve, everybody's on an email, so my email's on there, but if people do want to shoot any questions, obviously that come up after the fact, don't hesitate to contact us.
And we'll probably put a way to contact, we will put a way to contact us on the Recode-Troy dot, what is that, dot?
Yes, it's Recode. Yes, I think the email is already active. Margaret, it's,
Right.
I'm not sure if Margaret's there, but I think it's Recode Troy at Gmail. It's a Gmail. I think it's, let me just reshare my screen because I think it's on the.
Yeah, I think it's Recode-Troy. So you can ask questions that way, the public, the planning, any of the commissioners.
It's Recode-Troy at gmail.com for emailing. And then there's the Recode-Troy.com website where we'll be posting the draft and some other materials. So, and announcements for meetings, etc.
Okay, it's Recode Troy, not for the email, Recode Troy without the dash.
That's right.
Okay, thanks. And let me just make sure. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for sticking with me. I know that was really long.
Good though.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.